Here's part 2, finding the gap, filling the gap. What is the gap? The gap is the missing piece. In terms of research, it's the question that has not been answered in the studies you read about your topic. So have you been reading a lot of studies and you end up saying, okay, but that's not exactly my question? Or, okay, but that's not quite what I'm getting at. If so, that might be a good thing. It might mean there's a missing piece in the research. Remember, science is a building of collective knowledge. So the goal of science isn't to enhance any one person's ego. The goal of science is like the innate, to answer questions that are innately curious to humans in general. And so we combine together our intellects to answer these questions. So in order to do so, good scientists have to offer critique of others' studies. Critique isn't a criticism or a type of put down. It might play out that way. I mean, we're all human and people can get caught in their egos, but good scientists, when they critique another person's work, it is only for the goal of improving that piece of work. So each person has some wise insight to offer, and if they contribute it, give it as a gift to another scientist, that study can be better. And so that serves the greater goal of enhancing human knowledge. And once you do critique, if you're reading a study and you're thinking, oh, I don't think they measured that very well, that's excellent, because your views are worthwhile. You might have more to learn about it, for sure, but if you think it wasn't measured very well, that's a piece of critique, and that's what leads to development of new studies. And the new studies might examine the research question from a different perspective, or extend a research study to a different population, or answer a research question that hasn't previously been asked. So how can you find the gap? Well, start out by reading the limitations and future research suggestions of your articles. And when I advise you on how to read your articles, you'll recall that I told you pay attention to the discussion section, because toward the end of that section, you will invariably see the researchers discuss what's called limitations. And these limitations are the author's critiques of their own study. They're saying, you know, in our study, we didn't have maybe representation from this population, or we weren't able to measure this variable that we think is important, something like that. So these are the author's critiques of their own study. And these authors know their study best and know how it could be improved, so pay attention. They might provide the gap you're looking for. And I talked about limitations, but in the very end, you'll often find future research suggestions. So questions that remain unanswered that future researchers should consider are these. So that's the gap in terms of the papers. And then link those limitations to your own research interest. So do those limitations kind of get at this question that interests you? So if you're finding as you're reading that a lot of the papers actually answer kind of the question that you're interested in, that's okay, because then you need to think about a slightly different question. How can you change that question a little bit or change the method? And usually when you ask a slightly different question, it's your suggestion or your rationale for doing something different is you'll slightly change the method. Something about the method, the way they designed and implemented the study, or maybe you'd use different participants. So continuing on, we have some examples. What does the gap look like in a scientific paper? And these are the examples on the next few slides. So a sample gap statement, you might look for statements like this toward the end of the lit review. Here's a quote from a Murray article. Even if these past studies were methodologically perfect, however, they would still leave the basic conceptual issues we address completely unexamined. So you can see in that sentence they're saying these authors didn't answer this question. Many investigators did not relate either actual or perceived similarity to any kind of relationship outcome. So they're telling us what's missing. Here, the authors signal to us that this is a gap because they use the words completely unaddressed. Other phrases that might help you identify or form for yourself a gap statement are has or have not been, clarified, studied, reported, elucidated, so things that have been missing, is required or needed. The key question is, or the key question remains, it is important to address, and you're looking for gap statements in your research, and you're going to also be identifying a gap in what you're reading, and when you do so, always use a professional tone. Don't use phrases like "we looked into" or "we checked if." Always keep that objective language when you're writing it and tell us what the science was lacking without any focus on the first person. So here's another example. Other studies, however, have yielded negative or more mixed findings regarding the association between ethnic identity and substance use. And associations between ethnic identity and general social and relational functioning have been virtually unexplored in the published literature. So this phrase, have been virtually unexplored, leads us to the gap, or other studies, however, have yielded negative or more mixed findings. This also tells us about the gap. What you'll do is you'll fill the gap by introducing your hypothesis. Your hypothesis will divulge your proposal for filling in the gap in the research that you identified earlier. Tell your audience how you attempt to address in your project this lack of knowledge or understanding. You'll often find that the first sentence of the last paragraph in a paper's introduction might kind of start to get at the gap using words like therefore. So therefore is a good transitional word. Therefore, the purpose of this study was to determine the effects of lead on the hepatobiliary system, especially on the liver and on the gallbladder. So that word therefore leads us to the gap. Here's an example statement. This is filling the gap. The present research redresses these methodological difficulties and, more important, represents the first empirical examination of the short and long-term relationship consequences of egocentrically assimilating the partner to the self. So they told us how their research is going to fill the gap. And then they're going to tell us how they're going to do it with this phrase rather than. Other phrases that might help you to identify or form a gap statement are, we therefore analyzed. In this study, we investigated. Therefore, the goals of this study are, in this paper, we report. What phrase shows that they are filling the gap? Thus, the current study expands previous literature by using multiple, theoretically grounded measures of ethnic identity to capture various aspects of cultural immersion, subjective success, ethnic pride or belonging, and exploration of ethnicity. And so this is just another example. So to summarize, your purpose in the literature review is to identify a gap in the previous literature. So you have outlined all of these studies and linked them all together with a common thread, and at the end of that thread you say, here's what's missing. You can end your literature review by identifying the gap, the questions left unanswered by the previous research. So you're going to have this last paragraph identifying the gap, and then once you identify the gap, describe how your study will fill that gap. All that will precede the writing of the hypothesis, which is addressed in the next lecture. So all this will be in the last paragraph just before the hypothesis. Tune in for the next talk.